From making out with Trish Stratus in front of his wife to facing his own daughter on worldwide TV, this is every time Vince McMahon went too far in the WWE, starting with the time when he was caught backstage with Torrie Wilson. Back in the early 2000s, after WWE beat WCW in the ratings war, Vince McMahon was high on power, and he made sure to flaunt it on screen. Torrie Wilson was one of the former WCW stars who had joined the company after WCW was put out of business by McMahon. During a segment, Vince appeared backstage with Torrie and basically asked her how badly she wanted to become a superstar. If she wanted to make it in the company, she'd have to get close to the boss. What followed was a series of increasingly awkward scenes where Vince and Torrie kept trying to be alone together, but they were constantly interrupted. First, by Stone Cold Steve Austin, then Kurt Angle, and then Perry Saturn. Finally, they made it to the laundry room where they thought they had some privacy. Torrie started getting cozy with Vince, and he was clearly enjoying every second of it. She asked him to close his eyes, but when he opened them again, it was his wife Linda standing right in front of him. Vince tried to play it off like he was just doing his laundry, but Linda wasn't buying any of it. However, that wasn't the only time Vince cheated on Linda on global TV. In early 2001, Vince began a public affair with Trish Stratus while his wife Linda was sitting in a wheelchair in an unresponsive state. Vince would parade Trish around, making out with her right in front of Linda, who just sat there unable to react.
Roping.
But Vince's antics with Trish didn't stop there. In one particularly infamous segment, Vince made Trish get down on all fours in the middle of the ring and bark like a dog. He was screaming at her, humiliating her in front of thousands of people in the arena and millions watching at home. The power trip didn't stop there either. In another segment, Vince actually dumped dirty mop water all over Trish and claimed that he was only using her. The storyline eventually led to a match between Vince and Shane at WrestleMania 17 when Vince lost to Shane after Linda hit Vince with a low blow. But even after getting humiliated by his own son and wife in front of the world, Vince didn't change his ways. In fact, he became more corrupt, more power-hungry, and more willing to cross any line. This was most evident when he booked himself in a romance angle with Brock Lesnar's wife, Sable, in 2003. When Sable returned to the company in 2003, first she was put in a storyline with Torrie Wilson, but then she got into a feud against Stephanie where she played Vince McMahon's romantic interest. The two were shown getting cozy together in various segments, with Vince playing up his character as this powerful boss who could have whatever he wanted. But here's the weird part. Just a few years before this, Sable had left WWE on really bad terms and filed a massive lawsuit against Vince and the company. So when she came back and was instantly put into this romantic angle with Vince, it felt strange that someone who had sued the boss for that kind of treatment would then be asked to play his on-screen love interest. However, while we're talking about unhinged Vince McMahon storylines, you simply cannot leave out the Durag Vince arc. At WrestleMania 23 in 2007, Vince McMahon lost the Battle of the Billionaires against Donald Trump, which meant he had to get his head completely shaved bald in the middle of the ring. But what came next was absolutely wild and became one of the most bizarre character changes in history. Instead of just accepting his bald head and moving on, Vince decided to completely reinvent his character. He started showing up on Raw wearing a durag, and his whole personality shifted. He began talking differently, using slangs, and trying to incorporate hip-hop culture into his character. It was over the top, it was ridiculous, and it was totally Vince McMahon. He even won the ECW title, and Durag Vince was a thing till that one time when Vince faked his own death in front of the world. On June 11, 2007, Monday Night Raw ended with one of the most shocking moments in the show's history. The final segment showed Vince McMahon walking to his limousine in the parking lot, but right after he entered the limo and closed the door, the entire limo exploded in a massive fireball, and the show went off the air with everyone believing the chairman was dead. The following week, WWE had planned a special 3-hour tribute show to honor the deceased Vince McMahon. They were going to treat it like he'd actually passed away. It was meant to be this huge storyline that would keep people talking for months. But then tragedy struck in real life. Just days before the Vince McMahon tribute episode was supposed to air, the Chris Benoit situation happened. The company immediately scrapped all their plans for the Vince McMahon death storyline and instead turned it into a Chris Benoit tribute show. But while the Benoit incident was tragic, let's talk about the segment that literally turned Vince into a world-famous meme. During the height of Vince's power trip, when he'd regularly put himself in romantic segments with the divas, Stacy Keibler found herself in a segment that's become pretty infamous over the years. The setup was that she wanted to become Vince McMahon's new personal assistant, so she had to audition for the role. The segment showed Stacy doing a seductive dance for Vince while he sat there watching with this look of amazement on his face. If you've ever seen that meme of Vince's eyes getting wider and wider with excitement, it comes from this exact moment. But while this segment became immortalized on the internet, let's talk about the time when Vince literally had wrestlers kissing his backside in front of the world. If you grew up watching the WWE in the 2000s, I'm sure you remember the Kiss My Ass Club, where Vince McMahon would force everyone from wrestlers to commentators to literally get down on their knees and kiss his bare backside in the middle of the ring. However, there were times when Vince got a taste of his own medicine. For example, that one time when The Rock showed up on SmackDown and forced Vince to kiss Rikishi's buttocks, or when DX shoved Vince's head right up Big Show's backside during their Hell in a Cell match. But while all of this was pretty wild, let's talk about the time when Vince humiliated his own daughter in the ring. In 2003, Vince McMahon booked himself in a wrestling match against his own daughter. This wasn't just any normal match either. It was an I Quit match at the No Mercy pay-per-view, and it happened because Stephanie refused to resign as the general manager of SmackDown. During the match, just like the name of the event, Vince showed Stephanie absolutely no mercy. He threw her around the ring, slammed her into the mat repeatedly, and at one point even choked her with a lead pipe. The match finally ended when Linda McMahon threw in the towel to save her daughter. But even after the match was over, Vince showed zero remorse for what he'd just done. However, if you thought that was wild, let me tell you about the time when Vince proposed a storyline where he was going to be revealed as the father of Stephanie's child. Yes, you heard that right. In the early 2000s, Vince came up with a storyline idea where he was going to be revealed as the father of his own grandchild. Stephanie wanted to do nothing with it, and luckily the plans were scrapped before the whole thing could play out on TV. It just shows Vince was willing to cross any limit in the name of entertainment. But if you thought wrestling his daughter was weird, Vince somehow topped it by booking himself in a match against God. In early 2006, Vince and Shane got into a storyline with Shawn Michaels, where Vince literally booked a tag team match with him and Shane versus Shawn Michaels and God. The build-up to this match was equally bizarre. Vince created his own religion called McMahonism and declared himself more powerful than any deity. There was this wild segment where he cut a promo inside a church, mocked Triple H's entrance, read the commandments of McMahonism, and even compared himself to God. When it came time for the actual match, Vince introduced God to the ring with a spotlight and heavenly music. The match itself was essentially a handicap match where Shawn had to fight both McMahons by himself. The whole angle was designed to make Vince's character as blasphemous and offensive as possible, and even featured a segment that saw Vince suggestively heel Candice Michelle. Speaking of Candice Michelle, throughout the early 2000s, Vince was involved in several controversial segments with divas like Candice Michelle, Trish Stratus, and even his own daughter that made fans raise eyebrows. But Vince decided to take things a step further and mock Zach Gowen's amputation on worldwide TV. In 2003, Gowen got into a storyline where he was fan of Mr. America, also known as Hulk Hogan. The only problem was that Hogan was feuding with Vince at that time, which immediately put Gowen on Vince's bad side. Vince spent weeks mocking Gowen, humiliating him on TV, and even getting him beat up by wrestlers twice his size. When Vince got bored of this, he simply released Gowen from the company and never mentioned him again. But speaking of wrestlers who were never mentioned again, check out this video next about wrestlers who ruined their own career.